Over the past 5 decades, the SOP has extended from its genesis in the orchards and tobacco fields of Ontario to now operate in all but 1 Canadian province and the 3 territories. And it now approves close to 30,000 positions annually. As you can appreciate in this graph, there's a number of blips there, but the upwards trend shows how the program's growth really sped up in the late 1990s with the growing globalization of the Canadian food system. Over the years, the definition of primary agriculture has also changed. So we see this definition of what is primary agriculture changing from year in year, and most recently to include animal production. So the SOP begins in 1966. Prior to 2002, SOP participants from Mexico or one of the 11 countries in the Caribbean comprised the vast majority of non-citizen workers in agriculture. And this changed with the introduction of a new guest worker program in 2002, the Low Skilled Workers Pilot Project, which I'm going to talk about today as the pilot. And it has been rebranded several times. So it's now on its 3rd name. And it's now called the Stream for Lower Skilled Occupations. But I'm going to talk about it today as the pilot. So the pilot is this federal initiative to expand temporary labor migration in Canada, temporary labor migration to Canada, of workers that are designated as low skilled in any sector. So it is open to any employer who is approved to hire migrants from abroad. And it really came as a policy response to increasing employer demand for migrants created by the expansion of the Canadian economy in the first half of the 2000s, particularly in construction and energy. But rather than replace long-standing guest worker programs like the Seasonal Agricultural Worker Program, the pilot operates alongside them. So it allows approved employers in any sector or any commodity to request temporary visa workers to fill low-skilled jobs, including, for agriculture and food industry work. And so the launch of this new program widened the pool of agricultural and food industries that were able to access migrants. Some of the first to join were greenhouse growers and mushroom plants, and they had formerly been excluded from the SOP because the nature of their production was not seasonal. So, this program now gave this wider range of employers in those industries the ability to access migrants. So as the SOP was widening geographically and grew over the 90s and the 2000s, the pilot widened the pool of employers and the number of migrant workers in agriculture. And at last count, the pilot was adding an additional 9,000 workers to the agricultural workforce annually. But perhaps, even more striking than increases in migrant employment has been the rapid diversification of the non-citizen labor force in agriculture. So as I mentioned, prior to the pilot, almost all non-citizen labor, farm labor in Canada was from one of these SOP bilateral, these SOP migrant sending countries, so 12 altogether. And in 2002, the first year of the pilot, migrants from an astounding 52 different countries took up jobs in agriculture and food processing. And by 2007, that number had grown to 75. Who knows what it is right now? This isn't data that's available on the CIC website as far as I know. So this graph indicates the top 8 countries of origin for migrants issued work permits for employment in agri-food occupations from the period 2002 to 2007. And it illustrates how migrants working in Canada's agri-food industries from countries outside of the SOP now rival those of the SOP bilateral partners. So for example, you kind of have to, the top is at the bottom of that list along the legend. But Thailand and Philippines emerge in 5th and 6th places among countries supplying food and farm and food industry workers, ahead of these long-time bilateral SOP partners like Barbados or the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States. Most spectacular has been the incorporation of Guatemalan workers, a country that in 5 years was sending the largest number of migrants to Canada after Mexico and Jamaica. And almost all of this employment has taken place in Quebec, where Guatemalans have replaced Mexicans as the preferred labor force. This next graph that I have illustrates the number of migrants in Quebec and New Brunswick. And the reason New Brunswick is on there because that's how the data is collected administratively, but the numbers from New Brunswick are very marginal. So most of this growth is happening in Quebec. From 2003, the first year that Guatemalans were employed in Quebec under the pilot, to 2011, their numbers have increased 16 times to reach 3,654. And over the same period, the numbers of Mexican and Caribbean workers employed remained stable. So, overall, the migrant component of the agricultural workforce has both grown, but also diversified. In Ontario, 2 out of 3 agricultural workers are seasonal or temporary migrants. But we don't have a lot of data to really estimate what the migrant component of the size of the migrant component of the workforce. But research indicates that migrant worker numbers have grown within the context of decreasing employment for citizen workers. And research with agri-food employers has also shown that migrant workers are considered crucial to their business strategies and to the industry overall. Why the increasing globalization of Canada's agricultural workforce is of concern is how these programs limit workers' rights and their exercise, and in turn enable labor regimes that are not possible with a citizen labor force. In general, temporary migration programs use immigration and citizenship policies to position migrants in a distinct category to permanent residents and citizen workers, and to legalize their differential access to rights and their exercise. And so I'm now going to turn and talk about some of these features of these temporary migration programs through which that is achieved. And I don't have time, it's a big list, and I don't have time to go through all of them, but perhaps if people have questions, then we can talk about those in the discussion period. So first off, all migrants are issued closed work permits. So they're only authorized to work for the specific employer that's named in their work permit. So rather than getting authorization to work in Canada or authorization to work in agriculture or even authorization to work in strawberries, these people are given work permits that are only valid with Farmer Brown or Old MacDonald. And it's for this reason that many critics consider migrant farm workers as unfree labor because they don't enjoy labor mobility. And some have even suggested that they're even less free than undocumented workers who can vote with their feet if they don't like the employment practices at their work site. And these closed work permits really accord employers tremendous power in the employment relationship, whereby dismissal essentially results in deportation. Most migrants find out that they've lost their job when their travel arrangements home have already been arranged. And individuals have been fired for refusing unsafe work, becoming or arriving pregnant, for questioning their employer, or for their behavior outside work. Being injured or ill is also grounds for losing your job and thus your right to work in Canada. And you know, as I was preparing this job talk preparing this talk for you, not a job talk, but preparing this talk for you yesterday, I like my job. Yeah, maybe. But as I was preparing this talk yesterday, I get a phone call from a worker who I don't know. You know, my business cards are floating out there in the migrant community. And I get a call from a worker who is worried that he's going to be fired because he's been injured. And he's quite certain that his employers are going to be deported. Now, I get one call like that probably 2 or 3 times a year, but there's people in the room who are advocates and work alongside migrant workers, and I'm sure probably get those calls a lot more frequently than I do. People in need of hospitalization or ongoing medical care due to injuries they've sustained on the job are often deported after a brief sort of fix-it-up visit to the ER and denied their access to workers' compensation. And overall, you know, deportability is a feature of life in Canada for migrant workers. In general, you know, migrants that are fired are deported. There are no practically workable mechanisms to change employers, and there's no scope to appeal wrongful dismissal. Within the SOP, if you look historically, deportation rates are actually quite small. But you know, even though these rates of deportation are quite small, the threat of deportation constitutes a powerful disciplinary mechanism. As one Mexican migrant man said, then the bosses say either it's A or B. You put up with it or we send you to Mexico. So they don't give us anything more than yes or no. You leave or you stay. You work whether you're fine or you're ill. For this reason, we prefer to shut up and do what we came for, to work. We can't say anything because if we do, we're sent to our country. In addition to closed work permits, migrants' mobility is often constrained by the fact that many of them live on the premises of their employer. Because the employer provides housing and workers in the pilot also pay rent, this accords employers additional control and surveillance over their workforce. While some employers provide migrants with bicycles or even vans to allow them greater social mobility, you know, there are a number of employers that take these measures so their migrant workers can move around. Others restrict migrants' mobility by withholding their identity documents, installing curfews, through threats, or even by prohibiting the entry of visitors. As this woman said, the employers took our passports and other documents that we should have. The boss's daughter gave them back to us as we entered the airport. I don't know what her fear was, that I would stay in Canada or that I would denounce what was happening. We also have some great photographs that my research team has gathered over the years. This one prohibiting the entry of male visitors, or this one that also has a curfew. And you know, this one Guatemalan man speaking about the migrant women at his farm. The women don't go to church, they don't go shopping, they don't go anywhere, because if the boss sees them, she threatens them. She told them if she sees anyone there at the church, she would send them back to Guatemala immediately. And in fact, this spring, I interviewed a migrant worker that worked at that farm and indeed was not asked back precisely because she went to the church against this employer's wishes.